one?
Many people consider Netanyahu to be some kind of criminal. There are people in Israel who protest about this. There are people, even who I think aren't that bad, might consider him a kind of moral criminal for not being more forthright in his defense of Israel and for dragging things out. However, the International Criminal Court, I think, has got it wrong. And what we're going to be talking about today is the strong belief that has emerged, which is that the International Criminal Court is going to be issuing warrants for the arrest of the Israeli leadership, notably Netanyahu, and then a handful of other people in key positions in Israel. So welcome to the Daily Objective, day 209 of the war in Israel. Daniel, what were your first thoughts about this story and its wider implications?
So let me just bring in a couple of reasons why they think why there is even a case, or they think there is a case. So I think the most notable I've seen is the indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas and the firing on military targets with disproportionate civilian consequences, or even foreseeable disproportionate civilian consequences. It's hard to so this has been going for a couple of days. For a couple of days we kind of knew there is something coming. There is something coming against Netanyahu and other officials. And I think it really puts down... Do you want to start? I'm going so many ways that I need someone to bounce off, so you start.
Oh, sure. I mean, well, this is, again, the kind of inevitable consequence of the kind of thing which has been the moves which have been made against Israel ever since the war has broken out, and really the kind of moves that have been made against Israel for decades now by the pro-Palestinian side, because they've set out very conscientiously over time to undermine anything that Israel should have the right to do, particularly to defend itself. And if you look at those kind of claims that the ICC is making against them that you've just read out, not only would any country struggle not to do those things.
Let me just quickly jump in, because ICC obviously has not made any statement yet. This is what is believed. So just to correct it.
Yeah, and they're kind of poo-pooing any idea. There's been no official action yet, is what they've said. Any country defending itself would fall afoul of those things typically, unless it's really tying its own hands behind its back. And any great leaders from the past who we admire, someone like Winston Churchill, for example, is the typical example, would be indictable on those kind of grounds. If you look at the way that Britain fought against the Nazis, against Nazi Germany in World War II, they did all of those things. Now, it isn't just kind of the thought ends there, where you think, oh, well, that's what Britain did in the Second World War, therefore it's justifiable. You do have to think through, well, what are the reasons which would make it justifiable or maybe wouldn't? However, I think very much it is justifiable. The government has to go and end that threat and has to prioritize its own civilians' lives and own soldiers' lives first, and not the lives on the other side. And so it very much can take these kind of actions. However, Israel has not done those things, I think, by any evidence that we have. And actually, we have a lot of evidence that Israel has bent over backwards to not do those kind of things. So the fact that these international institutions are coming out and making these kind of claims against Israel, I think suggests a kind of other motivation. We've seen a lot of the kind of leaders of the UN have this anti-Israel bias. When we looked at, Francesca Albanese and all these people. I mean, Hillel Neuer at UN Watch is very good. He goes into the chamber and takes swipes of them all the time for this kind of thing. So I think this is motivated by other concerns, actually, than Israel's actual conduct. I think this is actually the thing that gets them to their goal of wanting to do this kind of thing, is the fact that they don't think Israel has the right to exist. And they're very much on the Palestinian side. I think that's where this is actually coming from. And it's a further attempt to smear Israel. I mean, we were talking just before we went live about the kind of people who get ICC arrest warrants put out against them. It's the worst dictators and criminals in the world. And it's an effort to put Israel on the same footing as those kinds of people, because these people actually really do get the importance of moral authority. And if you can just be dragged down to the level of, I think the people we were talking about was Putin and various Russian generals, but also like Gaddafi in Libya and all these kinds of people, then yeah, it's going to seem much more permissible in people's eyes that you can go and criticize Israel for doing what it's justified in doing. And that was my first impression about this.
So yeah, while there is nothing official from ICC yet, ICC chief prosecutor Karim Khan has made some comments, and he, for example, he stressed that Palestinian civilians in Gaza must have access to basic food, water, and medical supplies without further delay and at pace and at scale. And he also warned the Israeli government, if you do not do so, do not complain when my office is required to act. And so you mentioned, the Allied forces. I'm actually planning to go to Churchill's War Museum, so I'll learn a bit more about him. But there was, we of course know about the bombing of Dresden, about the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but there was also a starvation campaign. USA was actually involved in a starvation campaign against Japan, and when Japan finally surrendered, their people were starving, and the fact that they were starving contributed to the fact that they surrendered. So whenever I hear these people talking about this conflict, it's almost like they're talking about the game. You start a game of war. You have two equal sides, and you have rules you have to follow, and there is no real goal. You just play it. There's no actual winning. You just have to follow the rules, and that's all it is. And that's the way they really look at it, because they do not look at the fact, okay, it's Hamas and the Palestinian people who were involved in the October 7th. They, Hamas directly, for a lot of Palestinian civilians, they also directly participated. But even if they didn't, they do support the regime. Hamas still has the support. Hamas is more popular than Fatah, the more moderate part of the Palestinians. And when you have this, you have to realize, okay, what do you have to do? Israel has to, on one, completely destroy Hamas. There's no other way forward. And two, has to make the Palestinians realize that supporting Hamas is wrong. And then if they wish to live in a civilized world, they have to change. And if you enforce on Israel the fact that they do have to basically supply their enemies throughout the war, nothing like that will be achieved. Unless they, there's a good quote from General Sherman, who basically, during the American Civil War, he wanted to bring the harsh reality of the war to civilians, basically, to the actual populace who supported their governments. To make them realize, you have to change. You cannot be involved in war and not feel anything because of it. There need to be consequences. And this is why I think it's really problematic to see, basically this potential warrants against Israeli officials from the ICC, because it will make Israel not be able. Israel is failing hard enough to actually finish this war. Adding all of this on top of it will make it impossible. And I just read a comment that Netanyahu apparently said that he will go into Rafah with or without the hostage deal. That's surprising to hear, and I'm hoping it will happen. And we actually have a video from Netanyahu, so unless you want to add something, maybe we can play.
No, let's hear what he said.
You have to hear this to believe this. The International Criminal Court in The Hague is contemplating issuing arrest warrants against senior Israeli government and military officials as war criminals. This would be an outrage of historic proportions. International bodies like the ICC arose in the wake of the Holocaust committed against the Jewish people. They were set up to prevent such horrors, to prevent future genocides. Yet now, the International Court is trying to put Israel in the dock. It's trying to put us in the dock as we defend ourselves against genocidal terrorists and regimes, Iran of course, that openly works to destroy the one and only Jewish state. And in targeting Israel, the ICC would be targeting all democracies because it would be undermining their inherent right to defend themselves against savage terrorism and wanton aggression. Israel expects the leaders of the free world to stand firmly against the ICC outrageous assault on Israel's inherent right of self-defense. We expect them to use all the means at their disposal to stop this dangerous move. 6 months after the terrible Hamas massacre of October 7th, 80 years after the horrors of the Holocaust, the Jewish state calls on decent people everywhere to reject this outrage by the ICC, to stand with Israel as we fight the barbarians of Hamas and Iran, and as we work to secure a more peaceful world.
Okay, so let me jump in. So he made several, I think, good points, and I think I'll pretty much have to comment on each one, but I'll let you also talk at some point. So ICC was set up to prevent genocide. That was the first point Netanyahu made. And when I look at organizations such as ICJ and ICC, which will now both pretty much be against Israel, in a free world, I think such organizations would be good to basically exist. You know, you have this international organization to unite free countries to fight together against international criminals or rogue nations. I think that's good in theory. But what happens when you try to, they put out a warrant against Putin, for example, just most recently. Or, I try to look up the list of the indictments, and there is a guy there who committed, I think, like 64 crimes against humanity and 67 genocides. Okay, it's probably good we caught that guy. But when there is an indictment against people like Netanyahu and other senior, I think the other person who was mentioned was also the defense minister, Gallant, I believe is his name. Yeah. So when you put warrants against such people, then I'm starting to be skeptical. Okay, the people who were previously indicted, was it actually true, or was it similar to this? Just some sort of, vendetta against these particular people, or on the other side, it basically puts people like you mentioned, Gaddafi and Putin, which is the few names that I recognize, on the same level as Netanyahu. Like, are these people on the same level? Because Putin specifically, I think there's only 2 war crimes he is being accused of. And how many war crimes do you think Netanyahu will be accused of? Because if it will be more than 2, then you are actually saying that Netanyahu is basically worse than Putin. And, again, you're completely ignoring the fact, it's not as problematic the way Vladimir Putin wages his war. It's the fact that he started it. There is no justification for starting the war. And no matter how many war crimes he committed after that, it's illegitimate to start such war. And Russia is an illegitimate regime. So that was like the first point. Now you can go, and I'll have a couple more points.
Sure. I mean, the other thing that I saw was that the leaders of G7 nations were urging the ICC not to issue these warrants. And initially I thought, oh, well, that sounds good. Good for them. But the grounds on which they were doing it was, well, this is going to scupper any chances of us achieving a peace deal and Netanyahu not going into Rafah. The suggestion being that were these to be announced against the Israeli leadership, then they're going to become more entrenched. They're going to have their backup. So it's on completely the wrong basis. I'd expected them to announce that they were urging the ICC not to do this, because they would realize that the next time they go to war, then they're going to be subject to this kind of thing, and the chickens will come home to roost. However, unfortunately, it just isn't that. And people need to just realize that the next time a free Western country, needs to go to war against some Islamic terrorist state or organization or whoever, someone who's, initiated aggression against you, it's going to be really tricky. It's going to be really, really difficult. Almost any of the justified wars that have been fought in recent years would be suspect under these kind of rules. And I think basically the reason why people think, because I speak to a lot of people who'll know that, we talk about Israel a lot. Maybe they listen to the podcast and they think, you're taking a kind of strong stance on this. They'll say, yeah, well, Israel, October 7th was awful, but Israel seems to be doing too much in defense of itself. And unfortunately, I think that is just from the way that war plays on people's emotions, that because any country which is justified in going to war, it's not like war is a nice thing and like you can pretend that you can wage it in a way that's nicer than it actually is, even when you're tying your hands behind your back in the way that these supranational organizations want you to. You're still sending soldiers in with guns to go and shoot people. That's an inherently nasty thing. And yet, because bombs are used and all this stuff, the videos get around on Twitter and people, the kind of thought stops there. It just, well, this is unpleasant, this is nasty, therefore Israel must be going too far, with no question about, really how is Israel waging the war? Is it being too self-sacrificial? Is it actually right that they go by these self-sacrificial restrictions on them? And so on and so forth, right? Netanyahu's statement there, is good. They're always pretty good. I think, to be honest, their communication strategy needs to go a bit further than what they normally do. There needs to be much more condemnatory, and they need to kind of call out their allies. But I appreciate that they're probably worried about losing the little support that they have. But, the whole situation is such a mess that actually improving it on that front, I don't see how we're going to get any improvement just for the time being. But what were your other thoughts, Daniel?
So, war is hell. Don't start one. That's basically the main point I would always make. Hamas shouldn't have started this war if they didn't want such things to happen. I mean, they are getting off easy currently. It should be, Israeli response should have been much harder and much faster. It should have been, they should have been bombing and entering Gaza the day of or the day after, not waiting, I think it was like 2 weeks or several weeks. One point that, so this is not from Netanyahu, but one point that I think someone in the chat mentioned about the Rome Statute. So basically with ICC, there is a Rome Statute which you basically have to sign in, which would give ICC a jurisdiction over your country. And for example, USA and Israel are actually not signatories. So even if ICC issues a warrant, they don't have any means to actually go into Israel and arrest him, basically. But since most of the European nations, for example, are signatories, he wouldn't be able to travel there without getting arrested. But who is actual signatory of the Rome Statute? Palestine, which also means that Gaza, West Bank, as well as East Jerusalem, is considered a part of Palestine, and ICC has a jurisdiction there. And I've read in the article that the chief prosecutor Karim Khan said, "Don't worry, we will also prosecute Hamas officials." So yeah, Israeli officials, Hamas officials. It's the same thing, basically. It's they are all doing war crimes. Everyone is doing war crimes. There is no distinction between these two sides, and both of these sides should be equally prosecuted. So something else, Netanyahu said that ICC would be targeting all democracies if it targets Israel. And yeah, that's true. If someone like Netanyahu will get a warrant to be arrested, I mean, yeah, there is no way to actually wage war. Israel has probably led the least aggressive war than probably there ever was. I mean, when you look at numbers, and I don't mean, the Hamas numbers, but the numbers that Israel gives us, it really, and even if you analyze the fake numbers that Hamas gives, you can still get some context out of it. It does look like the military to civilian ratio is 1-to-1. So basically for every military death, there is one civilian death. If that's true, that's unprecedented. I mean, that's in an area where Hamas pretty much has no actual military stations, where Hamas always hides behind human shields. 1-to-1 ratio that you cannot get better than that. And that's something, that all, bringing back to the game analogy, they just give you rules. There's too many civilian deaths. Well, how many is too many? There's too many, Israel targets too many civilian buildings. Well, how many should it? These people just give out rules and giving Israel basically no means to actually wage a war.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Well, to come back to the war is hell point, because I see people react to that and then they kind of roll their eyes. This was brought up on Joe Rogan a few weeks ago when he was talking to, his name escapes my mind, but when they played the video of the airstrike against 4 guys walking along I think in Gaza, they kind of said, oh yeah, people will say war is hell, and then they kind of hand wave it away as if that's just a kind of platitude. And then if you think about in the Lex Friedman debate, Destiny brought up this kind of point that war is inherently awful and so on and so forth. And then he makes a moral point about Israel, about Hamas doing terrible things on October 7th. And Mouin Rabbani picks him up on it. And he says, in your first point, you say that war is hell. That's just how it goes. And then when it comes to Israel, you discover morality. And unfortunately, they kind of let that point slide by. I think Destiny tries to bring up something about saying, look, you can't draw a moral equivalence here, but it doesn't really stick. And I think people really need to, when we're making this point, we really need to underscore that the side which is defending itself is the moral side. So when you're saying war is hell, that doesn't just mean kind of both sides are equivalent, therefore both sides are awful, and just then you can do whatever you like per se. But the side which is defending itself is doing a moral thing, and the side which initiated is immoral. So I mean, and if people go rewatch the Destiny debate when Mouin Rabbani is making that kind of criticism, he's very much on the premise that he would be happy if he could just get the other side to concede that Israel is as bad as Hamas, because then all his work is done for him. Because if Israel is as bad as Hamas, then yeah, there's no good people here. Israel, we can indict Hamas. Yeah, he'd be fine with Hamas going away. But then the Israeli leadership would be indicted as well. And that's not something that we can concede for a single second. And I think we're probably more sensitive to that because of the way that objectivism stresses the need to have the moral high ground, and that you can't concede it. And when you see some of Israel's supporters, although they kind of get it sometimes, they sometimes will concede the moral high ground almost as a concession to practicality, that sometimes you just practically need to go in and do these bad things. But you start losing when you start to do that. And then I think the reason why I'm hearing from so many people kind of, yeah, Israel, October 7th was bad, but they seem to be doing bad things now, is because they don't recognize that connection. And that's something that needs to just be stressed a whole lot more.
So let me thank Bonnie for a super chat and Jonathan for his super chat. So last point I would make is, and it's a point that not only we've been making, but most importantly Ayn Rand has been making. If you accept the morality of your enemies, you can never win. And I think that's why Israel has to give up, and we've been saying this from the start, Israel has to give up on the idea that they are the most moral army. And not because they're not, they are in a sense, but the problem is the moral in that the most moral army is according to an altruistic standard, which is an impossible standard. You cannot wage war on altruistic premises, because inherently defending yourself is selfish. You're saying you value your life more than the life of your enemies. An altruistic person wouldn't say that. He would put everything else above his own life. So as long as Israel accepts the fact that, well, when, for example, Netanyahu is saying, or anybody arguing for Israel, well, Israel is letting aid in. Israel is preventing civilian casualties. Israel is trying to negotiate. Israel is trying to help that. None of these will ever convince, because you'll never be good enough. You'll never have low enough civilian casualties, because a good civilian casualties for them is 0. You'll never not destroy enough buildings, because standard for them is 0. The standard for them is Israel to basically sacrifice itself. That's the only way Israel could be actually moral, according to altruistic standard, is to give up to Hamas is to give up all their lives, and it's to basically let themselves be eradicated from the Middle East. That's the only way to be moral. I mean, just look at what Jesus did. He is the moral one.
Yeah, well, that's implicitly that is what they're holding. And something you said earlier, which I agree with, is that I think so. These supranational organizations like the ICC, the United Nations, all this kind of stuff. I think in a different context, these are things which would be desirable organizations to have. The idea that gets raised up around them is the idea of a rules-based international order. And I think that, I think there's something to that. But the fact that these organizations conduct themselves in the way that they do, and that they don't discriminate between the evil people that they indict and the good people. And actually, when it comes to Israel, the UN takes a special glee in issuing indictments of them. Then we need to get ourselves out of these things. Now, because they're in a sense the only players in town, and because organizations like the International Criminal Court, I think just basically because they're called the International Criminal Court, people take them as inherently legitimate. But there needs to be a much more concerted effort to say these are corrupt all the way down. We can't be a part of them because they're enabling bad people to do bad things, and they're undermining good people from doing good things. And we need to pull out. And if we need to set up our own organizations to rival them, then we have to do that. Or we take a period of time where we're just relying on our diplomats working independently, because we're just getting ourselves into a whole heap of mess with all of these things. And if the International Criminal Court does issue these warrants, then I mean, that should be the death knell to that organization. These G7 leaders should take it as very, very serious. However, unfortunately, there's so much inertia around these kind of groups that I think they just aren't going to do it. And it would be too much headache for a lot of them to within their term in office to bother doing anything like that. So, however, that would be the better direction to go in.
Yeah,
Any final thoughts, Daniel?
Yeah, something to remember. UN is not wrong or bad because it's slightly corrupt, or it's corrupt, or it's not as effective or anything like that. It's fundamentally wrong. If you take US, France, UK, Russia, or originally Soviet Union, and communist China, and you put them on the same scale, all these are basically the same countries, that's an evil organization. The only purpose of such an organization is to legitimize the evil regimes, and those evil regimes will use that power to attack the actual good countries. And we've seen that Israel is the most condemned country in the world, according to UN.
And how does that make any sense? And I agree with you that it's those kind of macro scale issues which are the real problem, but just on the micro scale. People, if you want to look up Chris Gunners, who used to be the UNRWA spokesperson, who's now coming back and doing some statements on their behalf. Back when he was still in that position, I think it's in 2019, he put out a poem on Twitter, which he took down, but which got captured by people, I think at UN Watch as well, and you can go find it, where he was celebrating people in Gaza who were collaborators with Israel, so who were trying to help Israel against Hamas. These people get hung and strung up on street lamps. And he wrote a poem celebrating that. So it's a bloodthirsty, evil person who is celebrating the killing of innocent people who want the deconstruction of Hamas. So there's really, these organizations are wrong for the grand scale things that they do and the actions that they take, but they just employ evil people at all levels of that organization. So yeah, it's on all fronts that we see the issues come up. But thank you very much for watching, everybody. We're going to wrap up just because we've got the reality show starting in just a minute. We're talking about the campus protests being broken up. So I hope we'll see you all there. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.